Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar on making civil society engagement in National Adaptation Plan, or NAP, processes effective and inclusive. My name is Pham, and I'm the Peer Learning Officer for the NAP Global Network. I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping points. Today's session will be about 60 minutes long, including a question and answer section with the guest speakers at the end. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself by typing your name, your affiliation, and where you're joining from in the chat box. And I see that people are already doing that. Thank you so much. We will also be recording this session and we'll share the video and slides with all the participants as a follow-up. We have simultaneous translation into French and Spanish, so please use the interpretation feature in Zoom to switch your language option. If you do have any questions, comments, or technical issues at any point during the webinar, please let us know in the chat box, and my colleague Christian will be glad to assist you. Today's webinar is organized by the NAP Global Network. In case this is your first time joining one of our events, the NAP Global Network's mission is to support developing countries in advancing their NAP processes and to help accelerate adaptation efforts around the world. To achieve this, since its inception in 2014, the network has continuously facilitated South-South peer learning and exchanges, supported national-level action on NAP processes, and worked on generating, synthesizing, and sharing knowledge on effective, inclusive national adaptation planning. In today's session, we'll first dive into a brief presentation on principles for effective civil society engagement in NAP processes. Then, for a large part of this webinar, we'll hear from an experienced panel of 3 speakers who represent both national government and civil society. They will be sharing more on their country's approaches to civil society engagement in NAP processes, and I will introduce them in just a moment. There will also be a question and answer portion where you can ask questions to the panelists in the last part of the webinar. So please prepare your questions as you listen to their insights. First, though, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Angie Dazé, Director on Gender Equality and Social Inclusion for Resilience with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD. She will be presenting the context, framing, and some key principles for effective civil society engagement in NAP processes. The floor is yours, Angie.
Thanks so much, Chi, and thanks everyone for being here today. So before diving into the panel, we just wanted to share a few framing thoughts on civil society engagement. And first, I just want to share a definition. What do we mean when we talk about civil society? And I really like the World Bank definition, which states that civil society is the space among family, market, and state, and that it consists of a wide range of organizations that are working to improve the lives of their constituents. So within this definition, civil society includes both formal and informal organizations, and may include community groups, NGOs, indigenous groups, and coalitions, among others. And it's important to note that since the establishment of the NAP process in 2010, it has been envisioned as a participatory process. In UNFCCC decisions, including the Cancun agreements, the UAE framework for global climate resilience, and in the LEG guidelines for the NAP process, it's recognized that non-governmental actors have a key role to play in adaptation. And when we look at the NAP documents that have been submitted to the UNFCCC so far, we see that more than half indicate an intention to strengthen capacities of civil society organizations. And importantly, engaging civil society in the NAP process, it's not just a nice to do, it really can make the process more inclusive and effective. Civil society organizations bring specific knowledge and expertise that's very often grounded in lived experience of communities. They can help to increase the voice of underrepresented or marginalized groups in adaptation decision-making. And in many cases, civil society organizations are already working on adaptation, so engaging them can enhance learning and coordination and avoid duplication of efforts. Working with civil society organizations, particularly at the local level, can generate a foundation of trust and buy-in for adaptation that's essential for the transition to implementation. CSOs hold governments to account for the commitments that they make, and they can facilitate sharing of information towards transparency. And as they're often embedded in communities and working in integrated ways, civil society can foster innovation and help to address complexity. And now I'm really happy to share a set of principles that were co-produced at a peer learning event in August, where we brought together government and civil society representatives from 10 countries in Africa and the Caribbean, including our panelists here today. These principles emerged from discussions that we had over the 3 days of the event, and they represent really important perspectives on what's needed for effective civil society engagement in NAP processes. And there's kind of 3 categories. Some really fall within the responsibility of the government in terms of ensuring that civil society representatives are included in key decision-making structures for the NAP process, as well as just creating an enabling environment for civil society to engage in and influence adaptation decision-making. On the side of civil society, it was deemed important that CSOs organize themselves into a formal structure to facilitate engagement in the NAP process, while also ensuring that such networks and the people that represent them in the NAP process are inclusive of diverse actors, particularly community-based organizations and those representing marginalized groups. Then we have 3 principles that represent joint responsibilities. So it was suggested that government and civil society need a structured approach to engagement with clear expectations, roles, and responsibilities across the full NAP cycle. Transparency and open sharing of information were also highlighted as really important. So these are a working set of principles that we'll continue to refine over time, and we really welcome any feedback that you have in the chat. And just to note that we'll be publishing them in an article on the NAP Global Network website later this year. Thanks a lot, and I'll hand it back to you, Chi.
Thank you, Angie, for laying the foundation for the panel conversation. So we will now move on to hearing from the panelists who will share more about their country experience on civil society engagement. And I just want to note that these panelists have also been part of the peer learning workshop that we held earlier this year, where we co-produced the principles. So I'm glad to introduce our 3 panelists today. First, we have Mrs. Maxime Matthew Charles, who is the National Project Coordinator for the Green Climate Fund Readiness Project embedded in the Department of Sustainable Development in the Government of St. Lucia. Second, we have Ms. Mana Omar, Founder and Executive Director of Spring of the Arid and Semi-arid Lands SASAL, an organization based in Kenya. And last but not least, we have Mr. Thabang Phago, Director of Climate Change Adaptation in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment within the Government of South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us today, Maxime, Mana, and Thabang. So to start us off, I have a question for Thabang. South Africa has a vibrant civil society network focusing on adaptation. What do you think this brings to the NAP process for South Africa?
Thank you, Chi, and thank you, colleagues. On the main, I think diversity of thought, different lenses. For example, civil society consists, of labor community groups, could be NGOs, religious groups, etc. And that would be a great benefit, for the process, unlike the traditional way of working in silos for most of our government. So me being, from the government, I might not always be on par with the labor lens, know maybe the religious lens or the religious groups lens. And the vibrancy and activeness is very positive towards the NEP process. So not only, the vibrancy of civil society organizations in South Africa on adaptation, but, also a responsive government, because it takes 2 to tango, ensures that we will then have an inclusive environment for policy development, informed by the realities of the grassroots level, which then include all these groupings that I have mentioned. This then means that then the NEP process can be well informed, you know, by various views, particularly those that implement policy on the ground. So one then would get policy that talks to the different groupings, and then it increases likelihood of it being successful. So what you'd want is high uptake and ownership of that particular policy, because at the end of the day, it would need to be implemented. So we, you know, as government officials, we want policy that benefits people, you know. In this case, when we're talking about adaptation, for me, would be around, you know, helping to reduce these vulnerabilities and increasing adaptive capacity. And that means that we must then start seeing policy from these different viewpoints. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Thabang. And I think what you are sharing validates a lot of the points that the international frameworks were referencing. And it's great to hear that this is playing out and these benefits are playing out in the context of South Africa. Now let's hear from a civil society actor perspective. Mana, you are very active in international climate spaces like the UNFCCC COPs. What have you learned from these engagements that you are bringing to your advocacy work in Kenya? Mana, I'm not sure if you could hear.
Thank you so
us.
much, Chi. I hope I'm in this webinar. So, yeah, I can hear. Let me just turn off my video if that's okay, because I think it's it's affecting the network. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible now. So one of the biggest lessons that I have learned from engaging in international climate spaces, like the UNFCCC COPs, is that policy and ambition are really shaped by who is in the room and whose voices are heard. So civil society definitely has a crucial role, not just in advocating, but in holding governments accountable and ensuring that climate action reflects realities on the ground. So for me, a key takeaway that has been of so much importance is translating these global processes back home. So whenever I come back home from these COPs or events, I focus really on demystifying international discussions so that communities and local organizations can really understand and use this information to influence national processes, like, for example, NAP. And it's about making sure communities are not just observers, but active shapers of policy. So another lesson that I've also learned is the power of coalitions. In global spaces, for example, civil society often works together to amplify messages. So I've applied this back by helping building stronger collaboration among youths, women group, indigenous communities, and even NGOs here in Kenya. That way, our advocacy is more coordinated and inclusive, and we speak with a stronger collective voice. So ultimately, in these international spaces, it has taught me that showing up isn't enough. The real impact really comes when we bring these lessons home and use them to make national processes more inclusive and effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mana. You've highlighted two key populations in climate change engagement. So we have women and youth. And now I want to turn this next question to Maxime. St. Lucia's NAP process has a strong focus on gender equality and youth engagement. What role do you think that civil society organizations can play in bringing these perspectives into adaptation planning?
Thank you, Chi. First of all, I think it's important for us to know that civil society organizations do play a really critical role in the adaptation planning process by bridging that gap in understanding what is really happening in people's realities. Thabang made that great point of really connecting the grassroots perspective into our government processes. So when we think, especially for women, youth, and those related groups, groups who are most definitely disproportionately affected by climate change, but they are least represented in decision making sometimes. CSOs help to bridge this between the communities and government as they're able to provide that voice and that avenue for those marginalized groups. For us in St. Lucia, CSOs have been engaged meaningfully to ensure that these perspectives are brought throughout our NAP processes, everything from facilitating community consultations, youth dialogues, for example, or assessments. We are happy to partner with CSOs to ensure that there is representation and inclusion with outreach and with project implementation. So often CSOs might know best who we need to reach out to in communities, and they are quite an information resource, especially when establishing baseline assessments, for example. In our NAP process, we do develop sectoral adaptation strategies and action plans known as SASAPs. They're meant to tailor and prioritize our climate response to each sector. So this is a really critical way that we're able to engage CSOs, particularly throughout those conversations when we're planning per sector from inception to validation on ensuring that vulnerable groups and that our adaptation measures, for example, are gender responsive and inclusive of vulnerable groups. And then finally, we also look at different ways that we continue to engage youth throughout that process as well. Throughout policy development, we have a number of youth internships that we encourage at the key sector agencies, for example, to develop and implement policies or projects to help achieve the goals of the NAP. So those are just a few ways that we engage, but we acknowledge the real value of CSOs in the adaptation planning, and to really understand that what's powerful about CSO engagement is to be able to translate what can be quite technical about policy into the reality of the communities, to communicate back to government what the real barriers that people are facing, and then to communicate back to the communities what opportunities lie, what capacity building opportunities are there, whether that's financial or technical.
Thank you, Maxime. And what I'm hearing from all three of you is the importance of translating, the different complex languages of the international climate change space, or even national climate change, into the accessible language that communities might prefer or might be able to engage or be a part of. So I want to turn back to Mana and ask you about a particular initiative that you're involved with. So you are currently working in partnership with the NAP Global Network and Lensational to implement Envisioning Resilience in Kenya. Can you tell us a bit more about this initiative and what excites you the most about it?
Yes, thank you, Chi. So Envisioning Resilience is a really exciting initiative that we are implementing in Kenya in partnership with the NAP Global Network and Lensational. And the aim is to amplify the voices of women on the front lines of climate change by equipping them with photography and storytelling skills so that they can document their experiences and share their visions of resilience directly with policymakers. What makes it special is that these women weren't photographers to begin with. So they come from different communities, many from pastoralist areas, and over several months, they were trained in both photography and climate change concepts. They learned to develop visual stories that show how climate change affects their lives and what adaptation looks like in their communities. So these stories will be presented at a national policy dialogue to inform and influence adaptation planning. And for me, really, what was most exciting was the creative and culturally relevant way we approached the training. So many of these women don't have formal educational backgrounds. So we used songs in the indigenous Maasai language to teach climate change concepts and explain the NAP process. So this method was engaging, very familiar to them, and incredibly effective. And you could see the confidence it gave them to grasp and own these ideas. So what I love about this initiative is that it's breaking down barriers to participation. It's not just about bringing women into the room, it's about equipping them with tools, language, and confidence to shape adaptation processes in ways that really reflect their realities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mana, for sharing. One of the key principles that we heard about earlier was having a structured platform for engagement between government and civil society partners. So, Maxime, I have a question for you. The National Climate Change Committee in St. Lucia includes civil society representation. Why do you think this type of formalized platform for civil society engagement is important?
Thank you, Chi. Yes, so our National Climate Change Committee, we find it to be critical to have civil society representation on this committee. It ensures that our engagement is not an ad hoc thing, but is institutionalized, and having a formalized coalition for civil society organizations, it ensures that they are represented on the NCCC to have this formalized platform to create continuity. It ensures that we have civil society at the table when decisions are being discussed. And we do recognize that being consulted after the fact is not meaningful engagement. So we're ensuring that through inclusion on the NCCC, the CSOs are a part of the full NAP cycle. And it also helps to clarify what the roles expectations could be. So to just draw on the principles that we've agreed on and discussed today, it does underline that need for structured engagement, which we know is one of the key takeaways from the Peer Learning Forum. So we understand that embedding these CSOs into more official coordination structures, it strengthens our transparency. It does ensure that there is two-way communication between government and non-governmental actors along all processes. And it also allows a big opportunity, we think, for bringing diverse voices into the climate space. And we know that the coalition comprises of a number of community-based organizations who also are advocates for gender and youth, marginalized voices, persons with disabilities, etc. So when we have that two-way, we're ensuring that the coalition can go back to their members and gather input and bring that back to the table. So ultimately, we just underscore that when civil society is formally recognized as part of the decision-making structures that exist, it really strengthens trust. And what we have found is it has very structurally included investment and buy-in for the adaptation plans that we create as well. We also have the NCCC embedded in our Climate Change Act endorsed in 2024. So this means it's also a legally mandated committee. And through being a part of that operations, it means that the government has that accountability to ensure that those voices remain as part of the conversation. And this just remains essential for inclusive implementation on the ground of all of our adaptation plans and strategies.
Thank you, Maxime. And it sounds like a very great approach, and I'm sure many other countries would love to consult and learn more about it. So I would like to hear from Thabang now. You're in a very special position. You've worked in both government and civil society in the past. How do you think this helps you in fostering collaborative relationships now that you're leading South Africa's NAP process?
Thanks, Chi. Yeah, so naturally in civil society, meaningful consultation is, embedded in the work culture. That's in my experience, having been on that side. And on projects and programs, communities are in most cases meaningfully consulted, whether you're developing projects or you're working on a particular program. And so in most cases, they get to form or be part of these decision-making structures where they influence and get to guide how the process moves. And which in itself is quite organic, and it's something that is mostly embedded. And then sometimes even, the process seems to take longer because of the consultation process, but it's because it's participatory, you have the co-development aspect to it, co-design and co-creation that is embedded. They normally say you work slow to work fast. That means, in the beginning, when you spend the time with the TV programs and all of that, and once you get it sorted out, you are able to chew, then you can go hunt again. So you can get on to other matters. Then you get to start working faster. On the other hand, and there's government, which it's presumed or, naturally should be, the one to do meaningful consultation because, often it's voted in by the people or citizens, but over the years, we started seeing the growth of these silos or this mentality around silos where people are just working on whatever they have to work in, despite other areas, particularly when you talk about climate change adaptation and response, where it's cross-cutting, that you don't need the silos, but you'd often get them in these departments and sectors, which we, I must admit, currently working very hard, at reversing. In South Africa, we've got what we call the district development model, which is an integrated planning approach that is very, very coordinated and brings in the three spheres of government, national, subnational, up to local level, to improve services or service delivery. Now, what I'm getting at is that it's much, easier to foster meaningful and active collaboration and partnerships when you've been on both sides, like myself. You said it, that, I'm in a privileged position. So you're much more aware and awake to the importance, not only of the outcomes that you want, but the process, in the process, what are the lessons? Who gets to influence this, guide this? Why is this person reacting in this way towards this problem? And how can we bring something or a response that is meaningful to this particular group? So having been on both sides, teaches one to be more of a, I could say, systems thinker. You tend to now start seeing things holistically and not only from a silo mentality of where you are and you are based. If you're a policy developer, if you're an academic, if you're a practitioner, then you're just sitting only in your own lane. Now, the difficulty and the time consumption of co-creation and co-development and meaningful participation then tends to become a positive tool in my arsenal, particularly in the upcoming review of the National Adaptation Plan in South Africa that we're looking towards or we're moving towards. So for me, it then becomes business unusual with regards to the NAP, consultation process, because having been part of the August event, the peer learning event, makes it business unusual for me with regards to this consultation process. For example, what does the NAP mean for me as a community member, or for Chi as a community member, Maxime as a community member? What does it mean for Angie as a religious leader, for Christian as a business person? Does it talk to them? Because only then we will be able to get the response that we're looking for and the uptake that we're looking for. And so once you answer that for the different groupings in implementation, then uptake and ownership tends to be high. And that's what we want. And a successful NAP or a NAP process could only be when we start engaging in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Thabang. And I think we're all very excited to hear more from you about the NAP review and update from South Africa as you implement a lot of these engagement initiatives. So we are almost at the end of the panel discussion, but I just want to remind the audience that if you do have any questions as you listen to the panelists, please feel free to share your questions in the chat in English, French, or Spanish, and we'll be sure to translate them for the panelists. So before we close the panel discussion, I have one question to all three of you. As you heard earlier, Maxime, Mana, and Thabang all attended the Peer Learning Forum on Civil Society Engagement, where the key principles were co-produced. I'd like to ask them now, what was one next step that you identified to apply, what you learned from your discussions with your peers during this forum that you would be pleased to share with the audience? And we can start with Maxime, perhaps.
Hi. Well, one clear step for the Department of Sustainable Development following the momentum and wanting to build on that from the Peer Learning Forum is just looking at how can we continue to deepen the collaboration with the CSO partners, and understanding that we wanted to engage deeply our CSOs directly into our ongoing SASAL process. So this is one of the first commitments that has actually already been realized. In the first week of October, we supported a training series with Canary and IISD to strengthen the CSO's capacity to engage in NAP processes. And one of the key activities as part of that was to facilitate a very specific focus group discussion, particularly to our tourism SASAP that is currently being developed to capture valuable CSO perspectives and to ensure that this is integrated into the planning process. So this was done with almost 30 CSO representatives and has led to a report of what the key challenges and barriers are that have been identified by CSOs hindering the engagement. And we got so many rich ideas as well for what interventions would be recommended to bridge that gap. So guided by the principle of inclusion, it was great to be able to use that opportunity to ensure that CSO engagement is embedded in shaping the priorities within our sectors and to identify those solutions together. So this is input that is definitely being integrated currently into our NAP process. And we also explored that although we are advanced by having the coalition as part of our National Climate Change Committee, how can we really continue to strengthen the principle of the formalized CSO collaboration? So starting the discussions on how can we really strengthen the institutional capacity of the coalition itself to support better internal coordination. This could lead to more improved engagement for the committee and the coalition to improve that relationship. So yeah, moving forward, we want to ensure that CSOs always have a space and a place to be involved in these consultations throughout our NAP process, and to look at how do we encourage strengthened engagement on the implementation side. And moving forward, we just plan to continue strengthening our relationship with the CSO coalition emerging from that process to ensure our engagement is structured and inclusive and continuous.
Thanks, Maxime. And it's great to hear that the team has taken the principles on board and viewed the process through that lens. Mana, would you want to share a bit more about your next step from the Peer Learning Forum?
Yes. So one of the key steps we identified during the peer learning session was the need to address the deliberate and systemic exclusion of grassroots organization from NAP processes. So many of these groups are simply not invited into the spaces where decisions are being made. And even when umbrella organizations are represented, they don't often facilitate meaningful participation of smaller grassroots actors. So in some cases, these umbrella bodies really don't follow democratic processes and end up monopolizing these engagements or simply just serve their own interests, which leaves the real frontline voices unheard. So the principles we co-developed in this learning session, like structured engagement, inclusion, transparency, and formalized CSO collaboration really resonated with me. And in particular, the idea of a formalized CSO collaboration and inclusion stood out as essential to fixing these gaps. So as a concrete step, I have started forming an alliance of small grassroots organizations that the government and other actors have a clear channel through which to reach these groups. And within this alliance, we are applying principles of transparency, fairness, and equality, ensuring that that the information flows openly and that every member has a genuine opportunity to participate in, for example, NAP discussions and processes. So for me, it's really about moving from rhetoric to action and creating structures that make inclusion real and not just something we talk about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mana. And it's great to hear that you have applied these peer lessons really promptly, and we love to hear that. Thabang, would you want to speak next?
Yeah, thanks, Chi, and it's great hearing from my colleagues. I mean, when we left, we were fortunate in that we had the Adaptation Network Secretariat also represented in the peer learning event, and that is an organization in South Africa, or a network in South Africa, or, of adaptation practitioners, but there's academics and all sorts that subscribe to the network, and it's representative in that way around adaptation issues. And so together with the Adaptation Network, we committed as a next step, the one step that we identified, to mapping the timeline for the implementation of the South African Climate Change Act, but with an aim to identify roles and responsibilities for government and non-government players. And this really came from that, the event, particularly around that principle around creating an enabling environment that Angie spoke to earlier on, that as government, learning from this event, how can we go back and start, creating that enabling environment or the space where we could effectively involve or include civil society organization. And so currently in South Africa, we work under the umbrella of the Climate Change Act, and everything is guided by this law, or the act as an underpinning law. So the act then talks to, the development of climate scenarios, where it talks about, forming a base or the science base with predictions and projections. And then from that, we get to then conduct some impact modeling and look at the different sectors and how they're impacted by climate change. From that, then we develop thematic areas around, we call them objectives. And then when we've developed these thematic areas that we work under, then we get to the indicators, so the monitoring and evaluation and reporting. So once we know what indicators we're looking at, and we delve into the different sectors for adaptation, then comes in the review of the national adaptation planning, the sub-national plans and the sector national plans under that, having been guided by the scenarios or the science base and the impacts and then the indicators. Then we can then have the review of the NEP that I spoke about earlier. Now, when we came back after the event, we sat in a physical meeting together with the representatives from the Adaptation Network, to develop a timeline that, identifies these roles where CSO, through this network can be more involved and included to support the implementation of the act. For example, might be in communicating events, developing communication products, or facilitating engagements, to groupings that we've never, reached out to before, to ensure that the process is participatory and inclusive. So we have developed a visual map of this act or this law, which will be followed by a storytelling narrative, with the help of the network, through support from the IISD and other donors, so that we can be a bit more inclusive. Thanks, Jim. Let me leave it there.
Thank you, Thabang. And yes, once again, I'm glad to hear that this peer learning forum has been quite informative in shaping the next steps for the countries to review their process of engaging with civil society partners. And thank you to all of you for sharing your insights and experience. I will now close the panel discussion, but we do have quite a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll be sharing them now with you. So I have a question from Ilaya Odundo. Hello, Mana. How spread is your initiative? Have you formed any platforms or coalition to deepen your work? Which I think you already addressed that in your previous answer. How do you engage with subnational entities and the platforms they offer in Kenya for your work? And what are some of the lessons for your improvement? So Mana, it would be great if you can take this one.
Yeah, thank you, Chi. I just wanted a clarification if he referred to the Envisioning Resilience Initiative, or I'm assuming that's the one because, okay. So for the initiative, we are really focusing on one county, that is Kajiado County. And for us as SASAL, we have platforms, of course, and we're now working on forming or really coming together with a coalition of grassroots organization, because we are also a grassroots organization that's really working now in only 3 counties in Kenya, that is Kajiado, Narok, and Samburu. And our programmatic work is currently just focused on Kajiado County because we are relatively a small organization. We are barely 5 years old. In terms of the subnational entities, we really work closely with the government, the county government of Kajiado, and we take that very seriously because we recognize the role that the leaders actually play in any of our programs, even in the Envisioning Resilience Initiative, where we're talking about policy, influencing policy, national adaptation processes, that we get county assembly members to board this program, or rather initiative, because we recognize the critical role that they play in shaping up county level policies and bill relating that actually go into the wider or national NAP processes. So what are the lessons for improvement in terms of maybe I would think about I would also think about expanding the initiative to other counties to have that diversified kind of messaging that comes out at the end of it. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mana. We have a question from Kimboa Richard, and I think this can go to all of the panelists if you would like to speak briefly to it. What tips do you have to ensure that marginalized people, youth, and children with less power compared to policymakers, NGOs, and politicians who have more power can have their voices heard in the NAP process, and for securing intersectionality in NAP processes in view of limited resources for consultations?
Yeah, Chi, thanks. I can take the first bite at that. Thanks, Richard, for the question. I think for me, like she said in the beginning, I've been on both ends, I've had an opportunity, to work on the grassroots to civil society organizations and also for government. And I've joining government, I had to run a donor-funded, program where I really need to make that link, very strongly, the policy link with the grassroots, because that's what we really wanted to test, that the policy is working on the ground and vice versa. So for the voices that are unheard, and this is why I wanted to comment on this. For example, we went to local level and worked at a local level, but what we did, because obviously in that particular meeting, you get people that are, louder, that are more respected in the communities, and, everyone tends to follow them, because if Maxime is a doctor and a professor from a university, whatever she says is gospel and everyone would listen. So we'd have a voting mechanism, and I'm answering your question related to resources as well, that you don't require a lot of resources. So in one of the programs that we did, to cut the time short, was to have a voting mechanism. And it's as simple as that when we had the interventions that we were voting for in a particular room, to get the voices out of the people that are not speaking, is to give them a sticker, and we gave them a green, an orange and a red sticker to vote for the top 3 interventions that they wanted. And only you could be in that particular room with the observers when you are voting, and no one else from the community, district, municipality, or even national government. And that helped us, to give everyone in the room at least a voice to say, this is what I'm wanting to see in my community, without Thabang's influence, without Chi's influence, without Mana's influence. So that is one of the tools and one of the ways in which you can employ to get those voices heard in a room where there's different people. Thanks.
Thanks, Thabang. And I don't know if Maxime, Anna, if you want to jump in, or should we? Okay, great. I'll move. We do have a lot of questions also. So the next one is actually addressed directly to Maxime. So it's a question from Lydia. What has been the experience in St. Lucia with grassroots organizations and communities? And do you feel that they are actively engaging with the process? And are there any gaps? And in that case, if how are you going to bridge that gap?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think first of all, we do understand that those grassroots and community-based organizations and groups really do bring valuable local knowledge to the table, and they do help make any adaptation actions that we plan more practical and therefore easier and more feasible to implement. At the Department of Sustainable Development, we do engage a wide range of partners, and that looks at just beyond formal CSOs. We also look at youth groups, faith-based organizations, and other community-led entities. So when we're looking at our national climate outreach, we're ensuring that we are looking at what works in our specific context and how to reach the people on the ground efficiently. When our sector partners and agencies implement projects, they also would be working closely with community groups to ensure that the actions are grounded in local needs. As mentioned earlier, it's really important for us to engage our community groups, particularly when we're dealing with baseline assessments and developing assessments for our communities, which does feed into policy and decision making. So that's a really important part for us. That said, it is important to note that yes, participation isn't always consistent, and especially with smaller groups, we can sometimes face challenges. They face challenges from maybe limited capacity or resources, or even not enough time or notice to take part in certain things. So to bridge that gap, we continue the discussion on what can we do through our networks and how to simplify our policy materials and how to continue to create more accessible spaces for continued dialogue. I think it's important once people see that their feedback can actually shape decisions, their involvement and their interest really does grow. So it is a bit of a work in progress, but the engagement with those groups continue to become more stronger. We understand that our processes aren't perfect, especially when we ourselves as government agencies can be dealing with resource constraints and limited staff, etc. So taking a few steps forward, and we do have an upcoming project, the Action for Climate Empowerment Project is, in which we are trying to actually work closer with community groups by translating a lot of our policy documents into simpler and more accessible formats, for example. So trying to take all of our NAP documents and to make that more accessible. We do also hear a lot of feedback about how we can make our monitoring process a bit simpler. So that is another gap that we're trying to address to ensure that our reporting and feedback mechanisms do remain open, and that communities can understand what progress and impact is being done. So just leading to a bit more transparency in the future, and hopefully leading to better policy decision making, and contributing to resilience for us.
Thank you, Maxime, for your answer and elaborating a bit more on St. Lucia's experience. I think we might, so yes, I think we might almost be running out of time for the Q&A, even though we still have a lot of good questions in the chat. And in that case, we'll be sure to address them later. But for now, I think it would be good to hear from the three panelists on a key takeaway message that you have for the audience after these discussions, and also reading and hearing from their perspective regarding the questions. Could you share like a very brief message for the audience to take away with them? And I'll start with Mana, if Mana, you're still there.
Unfortunately, I think we've lost Mana. She was on the road, and I think she was got disconnected. Sorry about that.
Yes, it's unfortunate. And if she comes back in, then I'll be sure to spotlight her again. Maxime, would you want to speak on your takeaway message?
Sure. I think in general, it's just my final thought would be that we should acknowledge that effective civil society engagement takes time. It takes deliberate coordination and intentionality, and it also relies on mutual trust being built. So when the process is definitely worth it, no matter how long it might take. And acknowledging that CSOs should be seen as key advocates, as partners, and as implementers, and seeing them as beyond just stakeholders or beneficiaries. When civil society is engaged as partners, the outcomes that can be made on the national adaptation front can be stronger, it can be more equitable, and absolutely better aligned with what the needs are of our communities. So finally, I just think that the process itself of inclusive engagement is in itself a tool for resilience, because with that shared ownership of what the challenges and solutions are, it makes our actions more pragmatic and more feasible.
Thank you, Maxime. And we can tell from the experience and the insights that you've shared that this is the case, and the process is really worth it. So thanks for sharing. Thabang, would you want to share your takeaway message?
Yes, thanks, Chi. I think, you know, what is helping me is, you know, understanding whereas traditionally we've always thought of, you know, the policy, the science, and the implementation as separate things, you know, and that we are now beginning to embrace that these are coming together into one. And that means that, you know, science or the academics can no longer be alone somewhere in a corner, and practitioners and implementers can no longer be somewhere in a corner, and policymakers in their own world, that we are meeting somewhere in the middle and are beginning to find each other. And we also need, like Maxime has said, acknowledge the difficulty of co-creation and co-design and the resources that it requires, because it needs money to be funded. For example, in the process that I was talking to, or program that I was talking to, we had to go down and spend time with communities in developing these projects or interventions, you know, and these are communities, these are subnational government, it's a lot of people that you're bringing in, but also the work needs to be underpinned by science. So you need to bring academia also, you need to bring policymakers and say, how do we find each other, and how do we come with projects that speaks to this policy, where informs policy, but as well are very impactful on the ground, and it exactly responds to what people are feeling on the ground, you know, as well as are able to address all these developmental issues that we have. So acknowledging that it's difficult, that code design, code development is difficult, it requires resources also. It's a message that I'd like to leave. But importantly, that we are beginning to see all of these things coming together in the middle and becoming one. And that's what we need to emphasize and hamper, that we need to be working together as one. Thanks.
Thank you, Thabang. And yes, I think it comes through that even though, the NAP process is meant to be very centered at the national level, it doesn't mean that at the local and subnational levels, these perspectives and opinions are also very crucial, and we need to attempt to overcome these difficulties and barriers for sure to facilitate this process. So with that, I think we'll now have to close the webinar since we're very close to the end of the hour. I want to send a big thank you again to all of our panelists and speakers. I know Mana it's not here, but we'll be sure to communicate this with her. Thank you also to the audience for your engagement and your questions. I acknowledge that there are some questions that have not been answered, but we will look forward to also continuing this conversation with you. So if you do want to share this question and get an answer from the panelists or from the NAP Global Network, please feel free to use the email address that my colleague just shared in the chat. And then we'll get back to you with the information that you would like. And we will also be sharing the recording and the slides with you all. Thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.